The gavel echoes through the courtroom like a cannon shot. The judge, his face red with rage, stands imposingly behind his elevated bench, pointing an accusing finger at the young black student before him. His words cut through the air with pure venom and utter contempt that would make any normal person recoil in fear. "I don't care about your pathetic excuses, boy. You will learn today what it means to disrespect my authority in this court," he shouts with a force that makes the entire room tremble with tension. The student, wearing his only borrowed suit and visibly nervous, tries to explain his situation with his hands shaking uncontrollably. His words are broken with nervousness as he pleads for justice, desperately trying to make the judge understand there's been a terrible misunderstanding. He explains that he was just heading to the university library when he was approached by the police, that he was studying for his law school finals, that he'd never had any trouble with the law before this nightmare, but his words seem to fall on completely deaf ears, as if he's speaking to an impenetrable concrete wall. The courtroom is in a state of complete and utter shock. The few spectators present exchange looks of extreme discomfort, whispering among themselves about the obvious injustice happening right before their eyes. An elderly woman in the front row shakes her head, clearly outraged by what she's witnessing. Two young lawyers in the back of the room begin discreetly recording with their cell phones, sensing they're witnessing something that needs to be documented for posterity. The public prosecutor, who should be upholding justice, remains eerily silent throughout this initial outburst, almost as if enjoying the spectacle of power being wielded in a completely disproportionate way. He flips through his papers nonchalantly as he watches the young student being publicly humiliated without any solid legal basis for such degrading treatment. But what this arrogant and completely out of control judge didn't know was that in exactly 17 minutes, a phone call would completely destroy his career when he discovered who the true sponsor of this humble person he was so cruelly humiliating was. The young student being treated like a common criminal had a connection that would cost this judge not only his job, but also the reputation he had built over decades of judicial practice. The judge continues his authoritarian tirade, banging the gavel repeatedly as if each strike were a nail in the coffin of the student's dignity. He speaks about respect for judicial authority, about how young people like this need to learn boundaries through exemplary punishments that will mark their lives forever. The condescending and prejudiced tone becomes increasingly evident with each word, revealing a pattern of behavior that is clearly not the first time it has occurred in that courtroom. Sign up now because you've never seen justice served like this. What you're about to witness will restore your faith that sometimes karma really does exist and hits exactly the right people at the most perfect time. This is a story that will leave you with a smile on your face and a sense that justice, even when delayed, always finds its way. The young student being humiliated right now has a story that would touch anyone with a heart. Born and raised on Chicago's South Side, he grew up watching his mother work 3 different jobs to pay the rent for a tiny apartment in a neighborhood where police sirens were more common than birdsong in the morning. His mother, a strong woman who never gave up on her dreams, cleaned offices during the early hours of the morning, worked at a diner during the day, and even cleaned family homes on weekends, all to save enough money for her son's decent education. From an early age, he demonstrated exceptional intelligence that caught the attention of teachers and peers. He was always at the top of his class, participated in academic competitions where he represented his school with honors, and earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University Law School through purely academic merit. His teachers always talked about how he would be an excellent lawyer in the future, always defending just causes and helping people who had no voice in society. He dreamed of becoming a public defender, dedicating his career to helping people in situations similar to those he and his mother experienced for years. But what was about to happen in that courtroom would be the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen, because this young man possessed something even he didn't fully understand how powerful it was. His family history held secrets that stretched back decades of American history, connections forged at crucial moments in the country's civil history. On the other side of the story, we have the judge, a man who built his career on intimidation, prejudice, and systematic abuse of power against vulnerable people. A Harvard graduate 30 years ago, he always believed his degree entitled him to treat inferior people as he saw fit. During his career, he accumulated dozens of complaints for inappropriate behavior, especially against Black and Hispanic defendants who appeared in his courtroom. He had a habit of making condescending comments about people's appearance and constantly questioned the honesty of witnesses based purely on racial and social prejudices. This judge had no idea he had chosen the wrong person to humiliate in such a cruel and inhumane way. He was accustomed to intimidating people who lacked the resources to defend themselves, who were unaware of their basic rights, who were paralyzed with fear before his judicial authority. But this time, he made a mistake that would cost him everything he had built over decades of his career. Because the person who was about to receive a call in 20 minutes had the power to end his career with a single signature, a single phone call, a single word, spoken in the right place at the right time. This powerful figure had been following this young student's career since he was just a child, proud of every academic achievement, every award received, every step taken toward his dream of becoming a lawyer. Fate was about to place these two completely opposing forces on a direct collision course. On one side, an honest, hard-working young man being unfairly humiliated. On the other, an arrogant judge who had finally chosen the wrong victim to exercise his habitual judicial sadism. Comment if you have ever experienced injustice in the system, and if you believe that people like this judge deserve a lesson they will never forget. The judge looks the young student up and down with a gaze that makes no attempt to hide his utter contempt. He comments on the boy's clothing, on how people like him always try to play the victim when faced with the consequences of their criminal acts. The judge's tone carries decades of ingrained prejudice, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum humiliation in front of the entire courtroom. He questions how someone dressed like that managed to get into a respectable university like Northwestern, insinuating that it must have been through racial quotas rather than personal merit. The judge talks about how affirmative action is destroying the American education system, allowing unprepared people to fill spots that should go to truly qualified students. Each word is like a stab to the young man's dignity, who remains standing, trying to maintain his composure despite the public humiliation. The student tries to respectfully explain that he's in his final year of law school, that he has an exemplary academic average, and that he's never had any disciplinary or criminal problems before this terrible misunderstanding. He mentions his extracurricular activities, his volunteer work at free legal clinics where he helps low-income families with basic legal issues. He talks about how he dedicates entire weekends to studying in the library, and how his professors always praise his dedication and exceptional legal knowledge. But his respectful and detailed explanations only seem to fuel the judge's arrogance, who constantly interrupts with sarcastic remarks about how criminals always have elaborate stories to try to escape consequences. The judge bangs his gavel violently at each student's attempt to explain himself, creating an intimidating atmosphere that makes everyone in the room extremely uncomfortable. The public prosecutor remains completely silent, clearly complicit in the judge's inappropriate behavior. He should be ensuring that the judicial process is conducted fairly and impartially, but instead he stands idly by while watching an innocent young man being psychologically tortured without any legal basis. His inaction is almost as criminal as the abuse of power that is happening right before his eyes. People in the audience begin to whisper among themselves about the judge's obviously inappropriate behavior. A woman in the second row quietly comments to her husband about how this doesn't seem at all legal or appropriate. Two law students who have come to observe the proceedings are shocked by what they are witnessing. They never imagined they would see a judge acting so disrespectfully and prejudicedly during an official proceeding. The young student feels his legs begin to tremble, not from fear, but from pure indignation at the blatant injustice being committed against him. He thinks of his mother, of all the sacrifices she made so he could get here, of how devastated she would be if she knew her son was being humiliated in this way by someone who should represent impartial justice. But that was only the first humiliation this innocent young man had to endure that terrible day. The worst was yet to come, because this arrogant judge was merely warming up his sadistic display of power over someone he considered completely defenseless. He had no idea that every cruel word was being recorded and documented by people who would know exactly what to do with this evidence. The judge decides to significantly escalate his aggression when he realizes the young student isn't being intimidated as he expected. He begins to shout louder, banging his gavel so hard that the sound echoes through the room like pistol shots. His veins are visible on his neck and forehead as he rants about contempt of court, about how young people like this need to learn respect through stern and exemplary measures. He threatens the student with contempt of court, a charge that could result in immediate imprisonment and completely destroy his academic and professional future. The judge sadistically explains how a contempt conviction would show up on any background check, forever barring him from passing the bar or working in any field requiring moral credibility. Every word is delivered with visible relish, as if he's savoring the power to destroy a promising young life. The student desperately tries to remain calm and explain that he is being completely respectful, that he doesn't understand why he is being treated this way when he should be hearing the facts of the case. He mentions that he has a right to legal representation and would like to contact an attorney before proceeding with any proceedings. His hands shake visibly as he tries to keep his voice steady and respectful despite the terror he feels. The people in the audience begin to become seriously disturbed by what they are witnessing. An elderly woman whispers to her daughter that she's never seen a judge act this way in her 70 years of life. Two experienced lawyers who were waiting on other cases exchange meaningful glances, clearly recognizing that they are witnessing a serious abuse of judicial authority that could result in serious professional consequences for the judge. The district attorney finally shows signs of discomfort, shifting restlessly in his chair as he watches the situation slip away from any semblance of normal legal procedure. He knows he should intervene, that he has an ethical responsibility to ensure the proceedings are conducted according to basic legal standards, but his cowardice and possible complicity with the judge's behavior keeps him paralyzed and silent. A young reporter covering other court cases begins discreetly recording the situation with her smartphone, sensing she's witnessing something that will become a major news story. She recognizes that she's documenting a clear case of judicial abuse that will likely have significant repercussions when it comes to light. The judge continues his authoritarian tirade, inventing non-existent regulations and procedures to justify his abusive behavior. He talks about how his courtroom has special rules that must be followed by all who dare appear before him. He mentions how he has built a reputation for toughness that makes criminals think twice about causing trouble in his jurisdiction. If you think that's enough, wait until you see what he did next. This judge was about to commit acts that would completely surpass the bounds of what is acceptable, even by the most flexible standards of judicial behavior. He was preparing for a display of sadism that would shock even the most seasoned spectators of contentious legal proceedings. Sign up, because this is going to get much worse before it gets better. What you're about to see will test the limits of patience of anyone who believes in basic justice and decent human treatment. The judge decides to turn his individual cruelty into a public spectacle of humiliation that would leave any heartbroken person feeling utterly sick. He orders the young student to stand in the middle of the room while he lists alleged crimes and character flaws that are purely fabricated and based solely on deeply ingrained racial and social prejudices. Each false accusation is pronounced loudly so that everyone in the room can hear clearly. He makes disparaging comments about the student's family, suggesting that people from poor neighborhoods like the South Side inevitably become criminals, regardless of their apparent educational achievements. The judge insinuates that universities like Northwestern have lowered their academic standards to accommodate students who lack the intellectual qualifications necessary to compete with candidates truly prepared for quality higher education. The judge orders the student to slowly turn so everyone in the room can observe him as he lists racist stereotypes about physical appearance, dress, and behavior. He mentions how criminals often try to disguise themselves by wearing borrowed formal clothing to appear respectable during court proceedings, as if clothing can hide the true criminal nature beneath the civilized facade. The young student feels tears welling up in his eyes, but he fights them back with all his strength because he knows that showing emotion would be interpreted by the judge as confirmation of guilt or weakness. He thinks of his mother working 3 jobs to provide this educational opportunity, of all the teachers who believed in his potential, of all the dreams he built about using his future degree to help less privileged people. A seasoned lawyer in the front row can no longer contain her indignation and whispers loudly enough to be heard that this is not a legitimate legal proceeding, but rather a flagrant abuse of judicial authority. Other spectators begin to visibly agree, nodding their heads and exchanging comments about how they've never seen such inappropriate behavior in an American courtroom. The district attorney finally shows obvious signs of extreme discomfort, but his moral cowardice continues to prevent any effective intervention. He should be protecting the young man's constitutional rights, ensuring that the proceedings are conducted according to basic legal standards, but instead he remains frozen in his chair as a passive spectator to a blatant injustice. At this crucial moment, someone in the room was recording everything that was happening, documenting every cruel word, every disrespectful gesture, every violation of the basic rights any American citizen should have during a court proceeding. And this video was about to change everything because it was being streamed live to people who had the real power to do something about this absurd situation. The judge continues his sadistic performance, clearly enjoying the attention and absolute power he feels he's wielding over someone he considers completely defenseless and without recourse for retaliation. He can't hide the cruel smile that forms on his face as he observes the psychological suffering he's inflicting on the innocent young student. But what this arrogant judge didn't know was that every second of his cruelty was being documented and broadcast to someone who not only had the power to protect this young man, but also to ensure that this humiliation would be the last this corrupt magistrate would ever inflict on any vulnerable person. The student, summoning all his courage and legal knowledge acquired over years of intensive study, tries one last time to respectfully explain his true situation. He mentions his basic constitutional rights, cites legal precedents learned in his criminal procedure classes, calmly explains that he is being accused without concrete evidence, and that he deserves to be heard according to the fundamental principles of American due process. His words are carefully chosen to demonstrate respect for the court while defending his most basic rights. But the judge interprets this display of legal knowledge as direct insubordination to his supreme authority. He explodes into even greater fury, banging his gavel repeatedly while shouting that he will not accept being questioned by someone he considers a criminal disguised as a respectable student. The judge declares that he is tired of hearing elaborate excuses, and that the time has come to teach this arrogant young man a lesson that will never be forgotten. He categorically refuses to listen to any further explanation, violently interrupting any attempt at communication. The judge threatens immediate arrest for contempt, even though the student has shown no real disrespect beyond attempting to exercise his basic constitutional rights. The situation has escalated to a point where it is clear that the judge has completely lost professional control and is acting purely based on personal bias and judicial sadism. The young student falls into a state of absolute despair when he realizes that no amount of respect, politeness, or legal knowledge will change the mind of this judge, who has clearly already decided to convict him regardless of the actual facts of the case. He ponders how his entire life could be destroyed by someone who should represent impartial justice, but is instead demonstrating the worst aspects of systematic prejudice. What this judge didn't know was that every word was being broadcast live to someone very powerful who was watching the situation with growing indignation. This influential figure was watching via a discrete feed that had been set up by people concerned about the judge's obviously inappropriate behavior during previous proceedings. The judge finally commits the irreversible act that would seal his professional fate forever. He orders the student's arbitrary arrest for fabricated contempt, based purely on his personal irritation with someone who dared demonstrate legal knowledge in his presence. This arrest warrant had no solid legal basis, and was clearly a grotesque abuse of judicial authority motivated solely by prejudice and personal sadism. The student is in complete shock, unable to believe that his life is being torn apart by someone sworn to uphold justice. He looks desperately at the onlookers in the room, silently pleading for someone to intervene in this blatant injustice happening right in front of everyone. It was precisely at this critical moment that the courthouse phone began to ring insistently. The piercing sound cut through the tension in the room like an emergency siren, abruptly interrupting the judge's authoritative tirade. And the person on the other end of the line was about to end this judge's professional life in a way he never imagined possible. Everyone in the room fell into absolute silence, watching as the judge hesitated over whether or not to answer the call that came at the most inconvenient moment possible in his sadistic display of power over someone he considered completely defenseless. The phone continues to ring insistently, creating a palpable tension in the room as the judge hesitates between continuing his sadistic humiliation or answering the call, which arrived at the most inconvenient time possible. After several rings, he decides to answer with visible irritation, hoping to quickly dispatch any interruptions so he can return to his demonstration of absolute power over the defenseless young student. The call he was about to take would reveal the most costly mistake of his life, a misstep that would destroy decades of his judicial career in a matter of minutes. The judge answers the phone with a harsh and authoritative tone, clearly irritated at being interrupted during what he considered an important educational moment to teach boundaries to a young man who dared to question his supreme authority in the courtroom. The voice on the other end identifies itself as the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, a judicial authority several levels higher in the judicial chain of command. The formal, icy tone of this superior authority immediately causes the arrogant judge to completely change his posture, shifting from absolute domination to respectful subservience in a matter of seconds. He can't hide the surprise and growing nervousness in his voice. The justice explains that he is following the court proceedings via a live stream established due to multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior during previous court proceedings. He mentions that he personally witnessed the last 30 minutes of blatant abuse of authority, blatant racial discrimination, and gross violations of the most basic constitutional rights of an American citizen. The judge feels the blood drain completely from his face as he realizes his sadistic performance has been observed by the person with absolute power over his judicial career. He tries to stammer out some pathetic explanations about his court's special procedures, but his words come out rambling and clearly desperate when confronted with the reality of his actions being observed by someone with real authority. But the real bombshell had yet to fully explode. The minister revealed that the young student being humiliated was not just any student, but the personal godson of one of the most respected judges in American judicial history, someone who had mentored the minister himself during his early years in the legal profession. This mentor had overseen the young man's education since childhood, proud of every academic achievement and deeply invested in his future success. The abusive judge feels his legs weaken as he realizes the magnitude of his error. He not only attacked an innocent young man, but also deeply disrespected someone considered a living legend in the American justice system. The minister explains that this respected mentor is monitoring the situation and considering personal legal action against the discriminatory and abusive behavior demonstrated. The real-time realization of the complete professional catastrophe is evident in the judge's expression, who now understands that his career has just been destroyed by his own arrogance and uncontrolled prejudices. The minister informs him that a formal investigation will be initiated immediately, that the case will be reviewed by a special disciplinary committee, and that a temporary suspension will be implemented until the administrative proceedings are concluded. The young student watches with a mixture of relief and satisfaction as the judge who cruelly humiliated him just minutes ago now desperately pleads for leniency on the phone. Comment if you want him fired or arrested for abuse of authority. The Chief Justice continues his damning address, explaining in detail how the documented behavior constituted multiple serious ethical violations that would result in lasting and devastating consequences. He reveals that the young student's mentor was not just any respected judge, but rather the man responsible for establishing many of the civil rights precedents that still protect American citizens today from precisely the kind of abuse just witnessed in that courtroom. The full revelation of this legendary figure's identity leaves the abusive judge in a catatonic state of shock. This mentor had been instrumental in landmark cases that defined how American courts should treat all citizens with equal dignity, regardless of race, social class, or origin. He had dedicated his entire career to combating exactly the kind of systematic prejudice his godson had just experienced. The consequences begin to unfold in a relentless cascade. The minister announces an immediate suspension of all judicial activities, the implementation of a formal investigation by a specialized disciplinary committee, and a complete review of all previous cases where similar behavior could have influenced unfair judicial decisions. Each word uttered is like a hammer striking the coffin of the corrupt judge's judicial career. Local media, alerted by bystanders who discreetly filmed the events, begin arriving at the courthouse to cover what quickly becomes a national story about justice finally being served against an abusive judge. Social media explodes with shares of the video showing the cruel humiliation followed by the epic turnaround that restored justice in cinematic fashion. The judge attempts a pathetic and completely inadequate apology, stammering about misunderstandings and professional pressures. But his apology is flatly rejected by the justice, who explains how decades of similar complaints have created an undeniable pattern of systematically abusive behavior that cannot be explained by temporary circumstances or occupational stress. The young student finally receives the respectful treatment he deserved from the start. Court officials approach him to formally apologize for their inappropriate treatment, offering full legal assistance and assuring him that no negative consequences will result from this terrible misunderstanding. He is treated with appropriate dignity as he watches the judge who humiliated him be escorted from the courtroom in absolute disgrace. But the revenge didn't stop there. What happened in the following days was even more satisfying for anyone who believes in real justice. Investigations revealed dozens of other cases where the same pattern of abuse had occurred, especially against defendants from ethnic minorities and low-income families who lacked the resources to adequately defend themselves against mistreatment. The judge was formally dismissed after an administrative proceeding lasting only 2 weeks due to irrefutable video evidence of his behavior. In addition to his dismissal, he faced criminal charges for violating civil rights under government authority, a serious federal charge that could result in prison time and substantial fines that would completely destroy his financial stability. His reputation was permanently damaged when videos of his prejudiced outburst went viral nationwide, being shared millions of times on social media platforms with universally condemnatory comments. No reputable law firm would hire him, and even minor legal positions became unavailable due to the negative notoriety associated with his name. The young student became a national symbol of perseverance against systematic injustice. He received internship offers from prestigious law firms, additional scholarships for graduate programs, and invitations to speak at universities about his experience. His proud mentor organized a special ceremony recognizing his dignity during an impossible situation. Systematic changes were implemented at the court, including mandatory training on unconscious bias, the installation of permanent recording systems in all courtrooms, and the creation of a hotline for reporting inappropriate judicial behavior. The story became a case study in law schools on how the system can self-correct when courageous individuals document and report injustices. The powerful moral of this story resonates deeply. Never judge people by their appearance, because you never know who is watching, who they know, or what power they might have to ensure justice is served. The humble young man who seemed completely defenseless had connections that literally changed the course of American justice. Share this story so more people see that justice still exists, and that abusive people in positions of power eventually face consequences for their cruel actions. If you enjoyed seeing this satisfying ending, subscribe, because we have many more stories where arrogant people discover the hard way that they chose the wrong victim to bully.